Redditor 1. I've never told anyone the full extent of my story. Some fragments may be shared with therapists or cautiously mentioned to trusted friends, but never the whole truth. Even now, as I put these words down, there's a voice in the back of my head screaming that I'll be judged, dismissed, or ridiculed. But after carrying this for so many years, I have to let it out. If nothing else, I need to see the pieces laid out in front of me, to make sense of them, or at least try. As a child, I was no stranger to fear, but it wasn't the normal kind of fear most kids experience. Fear of the dark, monsters under the bed, or thunderstorms. My fear was omnipresent, an oppressive weight that followed me everywhere. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake in bed, eyes darting around the room, trying to watch every possible point of entry at once. The door, the window, the closet. Hell, even the walls themselves. I'd stay awake for hours in a state of hypervigilance, my heart racing as I listened for the slightest sound. Eventually, exhaustion would claim me, and I'd slip into a restless sleep. But even then, the fear didn't leave me. It followed me into my dreams, or what I thought were dreams at the time. The memories come in flashes, fragmented and disjointed, but vivid nonetheless. I remember the little ones first. The small gray figures, no taller than a toddler, with oversized heads and large insect-like eyes that seemed to peer straight into my soul. Their bodies were frail-looking, almost skeletal, with limbs so thin it seemed impossible they could support their oversized heads. Their skin was the color of ashes, smooth and featureless like molded clay. It didn't wrinkle or flex when they moved, as if it weren't skin at all, but some kind of synthetic material stretched over their frame. They didn't speak, not in words anyway. Their presence was enough to convey their intentions. I'd feel their cold, spindly fingers wrap around my wrist as they led me away, through walls and into rooms that didn't belong in my house. The rooms were stark, featureless, devoid of any detail that might anchor them to reality. There was nothing inherently frightening about the rooms themselves, but the oppressive, alien atmosphere made them feel suffocating. I remember one sensation vividly, the way their fingers would run along my spine, pressing lightly against each vertebra as if they were counting them. I didn't know what they were doing, but it felt clinical, detached, and deeply unsettling. My child's mind filled in the blanks. I imagined they were hunting for something inside me, searching for answers to questions I didn't understand. And then there was the tall one. She wasn't like the little ones. She was taller, her head slightly smaller but still disproportionate, with features that seemed more refined, more deliberate. Her skin was different too, less like putty and more like something alive. I don't know how I knew she was female, but I did. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or the subtle, almost imperceptible differences in her form. She had a presence about her, an air of authority that made the little ones seem like mere drones in her service. When she looked at me with those massive black eyes, it wasn't just unsettling, it was invasive. I could feel her inside my head, rifling through my thoughts as if they were pages in a book. It wasn't painful exactly, but it was deeply violating. She didn't ask for permission, she simply entered, as though my mind were hers to. She would speak to me, though not in words I could hear. Her voice was inside my head, clear and undeniable. "Don't make too much trash, it will make people sick," she'd say, or "Stop cutting down so many trees." Her messages were strange, almost childlike in their simplicity, but they carried an unspoken weight, as though they were warnings of consequences far beyond my understanding. She'd thank me too, telling me I was helping them with their project. "We're very grateful for your help," she'd say, her tone almost condescending, as if she were speaking to a small child who didn't fully grasp the importance of their actions. But I didn't feel like I was helping. I felt like a pawn, a tool they were using for their own mysterious purposes, and no matter what she said, all I wanted was to go home. The worst part was the helplessness. Being with her was like standing in the path of a tidal wave, powerless to resist as it swept over me. I'd try to push back, to block her from my thoughts, but it was like trying to move a mountain. Her presence was overwhelming, a force that reduced me to a passenger in my own mind. And when it was over, when they finally returned me to my room, I'd lie awake for hours, unable to shake the lingering sense of violation. As I grew older, I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. I convinced myself it was just nightmares, the product of an overactive imagination. But the memories didn't fade. They stayed with me, vivid and unrelenting, surfacing at the most unexpected moments. In my teens, I found a book about alien abductions at the library. I devoured it in one sitting, and by the time I closed the cover, my world had shifted. The descriptions, the accounts, they mirrored my own experiences with an eerie accuracy. It was both a relief and a curse. On one hand, it confirmed that I wasn't alone, that others had gone through the same thing. But on the other hand, it meant the experiences were real. They weren't just nightmares or figments of my imagination. They were something more. Therapy helped, but only to a point. When I finally mustered the courage to talk about the memories, they came rushing back with a force that left me shaking. I remember one session in particular where I described the tall one and her invasive presence. By the time I finished, I was trembling so badly that my therapist had to guide me through breathing exercises just to calm me down. She called it PTSD, and maybe that's what it is, but naming it didn't make it any less real. I've read countless theories about what these beings might be. Aliens from another planet, interdimensional travelers, manifestations of human consciousness. None of them feel quite right, but all of them seem plausible in their own way. The truth is, I don't know what they are, and I probably never will. All I know is what I've experienced, what I've felt deep in my bones. There's a term some people use, post-abduction syndrome. It's not an official diagnosis, but it captures the essence of what people like me go through. The sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, the lingering sense of fear and violation. It's not taken seriously, of course. How could it be, when the very premise is so unbelievable? But for those of us who've lived it, the suffering is all too real. Livia, even now as I write this, I'm hesitant. I know how it sounds, crazy, delusional, like the ramblings of someone who's spent too much time watching sci-fi movies. But I can't dismiss my own experiences, no matter how much I wish I could. They're a part of me, as much as any other memory or moment in my life. I don't share this to convince anyone. I'm not looking for validation or sympathy. I just needed to put it into words, to lay it all out in the open and face it for what it is. If nothing else, maybe someone out there will read this and feel a little less alone. And then maybe, just maybe, that will be enough. Redditor 2. We were deep into the back roads of Edra, West Virginia. One of those nights where the world feels impossibly quiet, like the trees themselves are holding their breath. My friend was driving, I was in the passenger seat, and we had just dropped off his girlfriend. He decided to take the long way home, something he often did when he wanted to stretch out the night. It wasn't unusual. He liked to drive, and I didn't mind the extra time to zone out. The road was deserted, the kind of stretch where headlights seemed like the only source of life. As we cruised along, I caught sight of a blinking red light off in the distance. It was faint, barely more than a pinprick against the inky black sky. At first, I didn't think much of it. My mind lazily wandered to the thought that they must have put up a new cell phone tower out here. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find one, but times change. I stared at it, letting the rhythmic blinking lull me into a kind of trance. And then it moved. One blink, it was far away, a faint red dot on the horizon. The next, it was closer, much closer. My chest tightened as the realization hit. This wasn't just a light in the distance. It was coming toward us. Before I could say anything, my friend noticed it too. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, slowing the car to a crawl in the middle of the road. We both stared at the light as it blinked again. This time, it was directly above us, flooding the car with an intense crimson glow. The light wasn't just bright, it was overwhelming, saturating everything in a deep, unearthly red. It felt like the car had been plunged into another world, one where the color itself was alive and oppressive. I leaned forward, craning my neck to look directly into the light. The moment I did, an indescribable wave of dread washed over me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something deeper, more primal. I felt exposed, like every inch of me was being scrutinized under some incomprehensible microscope. It was as though the light wasn't just illuminating me, but peeling back layers of my mind, forcing me to confront every vulnerability, every flaw. "Drive," I whispered, my voice shaky. My friend didn't respond. He was staring up at the light, his face slack, his eyes wide and glassy. He looked as frozen as I felt, caught in the same unrelenting grip of the light. I reached over and shook his arm. "Drive!" I said, louder this time. He snapped out of it, blinking rapidly as if coming out of a daze. Without a word, he pressed on the gas, and the car lurched forward. But the red light didn't fade. It followed us, keeping perfect pace, hovering silently above the car like a predator stalking its prey. The interior of the car remained bathed in red as we drove. I kept glancing out the window, hoping, praying it would fade into the distance. But it didn't. It stayed with us, relentless for what felt like an eternity but couldn't have been more than a mile or two. The air in the car was suffocating, thick with an invisible pressure that seemed to weigh on us both. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light veered off to the left. It descended rapidly, coming to rest in a patch of trees just off the road. My friend slowed the car to a stop again, his gaze locked on the spot where the light had disappeared. I could see it glowing faintly through the branches, pulsating like a heartbeat. "I'm going to check it out," he said, his voice flat, almost robotic. He reached for the door handle. "Are you out of your mind?" I snapped, grabbing his arm. "If you get out of this car, I swear I'll take the driver's seat and leave you here." For a moment, he didn't react. He just sat there, his hand on the door, staring at the light. Then he looked at me, and something shifted in his expression. It was like he was waking up from a bad dream. He let go of the handle, slammed the door shut, and hit the gas so hard the tires spun against the gravel, kicking up dust as we sped away. Neither of us spoke as the car barreled down the road. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the red light chasing us again, but it didn't. It stayed in the trees, stationary, watching, or at least that's how it felt. Even after we were miles away, the suffocating weight of its presence lingered, like an invisible residue clinging to our skin. When we finally pulled into his driveway, we sat in the car for a long time, neither of us wanting to break the silence. My heart was still racing, my palms slick with sweat. I turned to him, searching for the right words, but nothing seemed adequate. "What the hell was that?" he finally whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible, "but I never want to see it again." We didn't talk about it much after that night. I think we both wanted to forget, to convince ourselves it hadn't happened. But it did. And it changed the way I look at the night sky forever. What once felt vast and beautiful now feels full of unseen eyes, watching from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to be seen. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that red light. The way it moved, the way it felt. It wasn't just strange, it was wrong, in a way that words can't fully capture. It was like it didn't belong to our world, but had forced its way in, leaving a scar that would never quite heal. I still catch myself staring at the sky, half hoping and half dreading I'll see it again. But deep down, I know I won't. Things like that don't come back for no reason. If it ever returns, it'll be for something far worse. And this time, I don't think I'll be able to drive away. Redditor 3. It was the spring of 1997, a time when the nights seemed endless, and the only distractions were the ones we made for ourselves. Out where I grew up, hours from any major city, the sky was as clear as a polished mirror, every star laid bare against the deep black. That spring, everyone was talking about the Hale-Bopp comet. It was the kind of event that drew people outside, away from the artificial glow of their living rooms, to witness something timeless and awe-inspiring. I was just a kid, and like most kids, I spent my evenings running around the neighborhood with my friends, chasing fireflies and inventing games that had no rules. But that night was different. A group of us, 5 or 6, had gathered on the edge of the cul-de-sac, lying on the grass with our eyes fixed on the heavens. The comet streaked across the sky like a ghostly finger, its tail stretching impossibly far. Still, we were mesmerized, our usual chatter replaced by quiet wonder. For a while, it was just the comet, steady and serene, a silent reminder of how vast and beautiful the universe could be. But then, something else caught our attention. At first, it was just a flicker, 2 dots of light, one red and one white, far off in the distance. At first, we thought they were planes, the kind we often saw heading toward the nearest city's airport. But as we watched, it became clear that these weren't planes. The red and white lights weren't moving in straight lines. They were circling each other, dipping and darting in sharp, erratic motions that no aircraft we'd ever seen could replicate. They would shoot off in opposite directions, then loop back toward each other, almost as if they were playing some cosmic game of tag. We stared, transfixed, our initial curiosity giving way to a growing sense of unease. "What is that?" someone whispered. "Planes don't move like that," I said, my voice trembling just enough to betray my nerves. As we watched, the lights grew brighter, their movements more frantic. Then, something happened that made my stomach drop. The red and white lights stopped circling and hovered, motionless, for a moment that felt like an eternity, and then, as if they'd been sucked into a vortex, they merged into a single, impossibly bright point of light. We barely had time to process what we'd just seen when the single light shot out 3 smaller orbs, each as bright and sharp as the original. They scattered like sparks from a firework, zipping through the sky in unpredictable patterns. Unlike the first 2 lights, these didn't seem to be interacting with each other. They moved independently, as if each had its own agenda. But their movements were just as unnatural, just as unsettling. "Are those planes?" another voice asked, though none of us believed it. "No way," I said, my eyes glued to the sky. "They're too fast." We watched for hours, unable to look away. The lights continued their bizarre dance, splitting apart, merging again, accelerating and stopping on a dime. They seemed to defy every law of physics we'd ever learned in school. Occasionally, one of the orbs would zip so close we thought it might come down to the ground, but it always shot back up, as if testing the limits of our courage. As the night wore on, our awe turned to fear. There was something unnerving about the way the lights moved, something that felt deliberate. It wasn't just randomness. It was as if they were aware of us, watching us as intently as we were watching them. I remember feeling exposed, like a bug under a magnifying glass, powerless and insignificant. Finally, just before the lights disappeared, they stopped moving altogether, hanging motionless in the sky like stars. And then, in a burst of speed so sudden it made my head spin, they shot off into the darkness, leaving nothing but silence in their wake. For a long time, none of us spoke. We just lay there, staring at the empty sky, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. Eventually, one by one, we got up and walked home. I remember my heart pounding in my chest, every shadow and sound on the way back feeling like a potential threat. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The next morning, I rushed to grab the local paper, hoping for some explanation, and there it was, right on the front page. "Mysterious lights over hometown." The article said the newspaper had received several calls about strange lights in the sky the night before. The official explanation? The local airport was testing new aircraft. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make it fit. What kind of aircraft moves like that? What kind of test would send glowing orbs zipping around the night sky for hours? It didn't make sense, and the more I thought about it, the less I believed it. Over the years, I've talked to the friends who were with me that night, and every time the conversation feels the same. None of us can explain what we saw. None of us can forget it either. It's burned into our memories as vivid now as it was then. We've all gone on with our lives, but every so often, one of us will bring it up, and the fear comes rushing back, just as fresh as it was that night. To this day, I haven't seen anything like it again, but whenever I look up at the night sky, I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. And if it does, will we be ready for it? Or will we be left staring, helpless and terrified, as it dances just out of reach, taunting us with its mystery? Redditor 4. It was the summer of 1997 in Colorado Springs, and I was just 8 years old. My world was small then: school, my house, and the park down the street. That park was my sanctuary, a little corner of the world where I could bury my Happy Meal toys in the sand volleyball court, dig them back up, and repeat the process endlessly, lost in my own little games. It was a warm afternoon, the kind where the sun kissed the tops of the trees and the air carried the faint smell of freshly cut grass. The park was alive with the usual sounds: the distant hum of traffic from the busy streets just a block away, the yaps of neighborhood dogs, the chatter of birds flitting from branch to branch. I wasn't paying attention to any of it, though. My focus was on the sand in front of me, the small plastic figures I was burying and uncovering, the perfect rhythm of my childhood world. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. At first, I didn't notice what was wrong. My hands were in the sand and I was still engrossed in my game, but something felt off. I froze, my fingers tightening around one of the toys. That's when I realized it. The world had gone silent. It wasn't just a quiet moment, the kind that happens when the wind dies down and the neighborhood takes a collective breath. No, this was total silence, unnatural and oppressive. There was no distant hum of cars, no dogs barking, no birds chirping. Even the sound of my own breath seemed muted, as if I were underwater. The silence was so complete it felt like a vacuum, as if the world around me had been swallowed whole. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, a deep instinctual unease that made me glance up from the sand. My eyes went straight to the street that bordered the park, and that's when I saw it. It looked like a stealth bomber turned sideways, its pointed nose leading the way, one wing angled down toward the street, the other pointed up at the sky. But it wasn't flying high above like a normal plane, it was cruising just over the road, barely skimming the tops of parked cars. It moved impossibly slow, gliding at what couldn't have been more than 3 miles per hour. The entire craft was jet black, so shiny it reflected the sunlight like polished obsidian. It was massive, as tall as a house and shaped like an arrowhead, with sharp angular lines that made it look like something out of a science fiction movie. It didn't make a sound, not even a whisper of wind as it passed. It was as if the silence surrounding me had come from the craft itself, a bubble of stillness that muted the world as it moved. I stared, frozen, as it floated down the street, its motion so smooth it was almost hypnotic. It didn't wobble or shift, and there were no visible engines or lights, just that gleaming black surface and the eerie, deliberate way it glided forward. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The moment stretched on forever, but in reality it must have been only 20 seconds. I watched as the craft passed behind a row of 2-story houses on the other side of the street, disappearing from view. The instant it was gone, the world snapped back into focus. The sounds came rushing back all at once, birds chirping, a car horn blaring in the distance, the bark of a dog from a nearby yard. The sudden cacophony was overwhelming, almost jarring, and I stumbled to my feet, my heart still racing. The sand clung to my sweaty hands and I wiped them on my shorts, but the dampness didn't go away. That's when I realized my pants were. At the time, I didn't fully understand what had happened. I was scared, yes, but more than that, I was confused. The craft was unlike anything I had ever seen, and the way it had moved, the silence it carried with it, felt wrong, unnatural. I wanted to tell someone, to ask my mom or my dad what it could have been, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the silence had wrapped around me, pressing down like a heavy weight. Maybe it was the way the craft had seemed so deliberate, like it was searching for something or someone. Or maybe it was the nagging feeling that whatever it wasn't meant to be seen. Whatever the reason, I kept my mouth shut. I didn't tell my parents, didn't mention it to my friends, didn't even write it down in my diary. I just buried it, the same way I'd been burying my toys in the sand. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the craft again, its sharp edges cutting through the air, the gleam of its surface catching the sunlight. I wondered if anyone else had seen it. Surely someone must have. It was huge, impossible to miss. But the next day, there was nothing. No news stories, no murmurs from the neighbors. It was as if it had never happened. Years later, the memory still lingers, as vivid as the day it happened. I've spent countless nights replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of what I saw. Was it some kind of experimental military aircraft, a drone, a UFO? I don't know. I'm not sure I'll ever know. But one thing I do know is this. Whatever it wasn't meant for me to see. Sometimes, when I think back on that day, I wonder why I felt so strongly about keeping it to myself. Was it fear, shame, or was it something else, something deeper, something I can't quite put into words? Maybe the craft wasn't just a strange object in the sky. Maybe it was a warning, a glimpse into a world that we're not supposed to understand. I still look up at the sky sometimes, half expecting to see it again, But it's never there, just stars, planes, and the occasional bird. Normal things. Safe things. And yet, every time I hear a moment of unexpected silence, my heart skips a beat, and I find myself looking over my shoulder, waiting for the black arrowhead to glide back into my life. I hope it never does, but if it does, I hope I'm not alone, because some things are too big, too strange to face on your own. Redditor 5. It was a typical sunny afternoon in Los Angeles in 2010. I was tidying up my small apartment, the kind of mindless cleaning that gives you just enough room to let your thoughts wander. The kitchen lamp above my counter caught my attention when it started swinging slightly, and soon after, I felt the familiar sway of the building. Earthquake. Nothing unusual for California, but enough to give me pause. It wasn't a particularly strong tremor, just one of those moments where you hold your breath and wait to see if it's going to get worse. I stood still, letting the gentle rocking subside, and once it did, I picked up my phone to call a friend. "Did you feel that?" I asked her when she answered. "Yeah," she replied. "Nothing crazy though. You good?" I leaned out onto my balcony as we chatted. My apartment overlooked the winding trails of Runyon Canyon, a popular hiking spot where joggers and dog walkers passed by at all hours of the day. The afternoon sun bathed the area in a golden light, casting long shadows from the hills and trees. The conversation drifted, but as it did, something caught my eye. High above the canyon, something was hovering. At first, I thought it might be a helicopter. It wasn't unusual to see one circling over the area, especially with the frequent brush fires and occasional search and rescue operations. But as I squinted at it, I realized it wasn't moving like a helicopter. It wasn't moving at all. The object was just there, hanging in the air, perfectly still. It was too small and too low to be a plane, and its shape was strange, almost bulbous, like an oblong metallic balloon. The way it reflected the sunlight was also odd. It shimmered at some angles, catching the light just right, but then it would suddenly look dull, blending almost seamlessly with the sky. It was as though it was camouflaging itself, not fully wanting to be seen. "Hold on," I said into the phone, stepping further onto the balcony. "There's something weird out here." "What do you mean?" my friend asked. "I don't know, there's this thing over the canyon. It's just hovering there." I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than 3 minutes. It didn't bob or sway, just hung there in defiance of every law of physics I understood. Then, slowly, it started to move west. When I say move, I don't mean it flew or zipped across the sky like you'd expect from an aircraft. It crept. It was slower than anything I'd ever seen, slower than a blimp, slower than a kite caught in a weak breeze. Its motion was deliberate, almost lazy, like it didn't have a care in the world. The whole thing was bizarre, and the longer I watched, the more unsettling it became. "Do you think it's a drone?" my friend asked. "Not like any drone I've ever seen," I replied. "It's too big, and it's not making any noise." I ran back inside to grab my old digital camera, the kind with a zoom that barely worked. When I returned to the balcony, the object was still there, crawling across the sky. I snapped a few pictures, knowing full well the camera probably wasn't doing it justice. Still, I had to try. As I was lining up another shot, the object did something that made my stomach drop. After moving westward at its snail's pace, it stopped again, hanging motionless in the air for several seconds. Then, in the blink of an eye, it darted upward at an impossible speed. I don't mean fast like a jet or a rocket, I mean impossible. One moment it was there and the next it was gone, shooting into the sky and vanishing as though it had never been there at all. I stood there, stunned, my camera still in my hands. My friend was asking something on the phone, but her voice sounded distant, like I was hearing her through a fog. My heart was racing and my hands felt clammy. Whatever I had just seen, it wasn't normal. It wasn't something you could explain away as a plane or a weather balloon or some kind of military. It had moved in ways that no man-made object should be able to move. And the way it had shimmered, reflecting and absorbing the light, it didn't feel like it belonged in our world. When I finally hung up the phone, I went back inside and loaded the pictures onto my laptop. At first glance, it looked like I hadn't captured anything. The sky was a washed-out blue, the kind of grainy mess you'd expect from a cheap digital camera. But as I zoomed in, there it was. In 3 of the photos, you could see the object, a small metallic dot, hanging against the sky, just as I'd seen it. The images weren't clear enough to make out any details, but they were enough to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. I sat there for a long time, staring at the pictures. My mind raced through every possibility, every logical explanation, but none of them fit. The object had been real, I knew that much, but what it was, I couldn't begin to say. Over the years, I've come to accept that I may never know. Was it something man-made, a government experiment, or was it something else entirely, something not of this world? I don't have the answers. All I know is that it changed the way I look at the sky. What used to be a source of wonder now feels full of mystery and unease, a reminder that there's so much we don't understand about the world around us. Every now and then I think about that day. I still have the pictures saved on an old hard drive somewhere, and when I look at them, I feel the same mix of awe and dread that I felt standing on that balcony. Whatever I saw, it was real, and whatever it wasn't meant to be understood. Redditor 6. It was a road trip like any other, a late-night drive back to Los Angeles after visiting family near Phoenix. My friend and I had done this route before. Long stretches of open highway, the kind of drive where the monotony lulls you into a rhythm. We were westbound on Highway 58, not far out of Boron, California, heading toward Mojave to catch the 14. It was dark, the kind of dark that swallows everything beyond the reach of your headlights. The music was loud, the kind of playlist you throw on to keep you awake and sharp. We were laughing, singing along, just trying to pass the time. And then everything changed. The next thing I remember, I wasn't driving. I was sitting still, my hands on the steering wheel, but the car wasn't moving. The engine was off and the faint hum of the highway had been replaced by an eerie silence. I blinked, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The road ahead stretched out into the darkness, empty. Behind us, there was nothing but the faint outline of the desert under the dim glow of the stars. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3 hours had passed. My chest tightened as the weight of that realization hit me. The last thing I remembered was cruising down the highway, the music blasting, the headlights carving a path through the night. But now, here we were, pulled over on the side of the road with no memory of how we'd gotten there. I turned to my friend, slumped in the passenger seat, fast asleep. His head rested against the window, his breathing steady and peaceful, as if we'd been parked there for hours. I shook his shoulder gently at first, then harder when he didn't respond. His eyes fluttered open and he looked around, disoriented. What's going on?" he asked, his voice groggy. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know how we got here." We both sat there for a moment, staring out at the empty road, trying to piece together what had happened. My heart was racing and my hands felt clammy on the steering wheel. My friend rubbed his eyes, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to fear. "We were driving," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were driving and then nothing." I nodded, my throat tight. "Same. 1 minute we were on the highway and the next, this." We both stepped out of the car, the cool desert air hitting us like a slap. The night was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing down on you. I looked up at the sky, half expecting to see something, lights, movement, anything, but it was just stars, scattered across the blackness like grains of salt. The car looked untouched, as if it had simply been parked there on purpose. There were no signs of damage, no indication that anything unusual had happened. But the unease in my gut told me otherwise. Something had happened. I didn't know what, but it wasn't normal. My friend paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "What the hell is going on, man?" he muttered. "We lost 3 hours. 3 hours. How does that even happen?" I didn't have an answer. I kept replaying the last thing I could remember, the music, the headlights, the steady hum of the tires on the road. But it was like hitting a brick wall. There was nothing after that, just a void where time should have been. After a while, we got back in the car. There wasn't much else we could do. The drive home was quiet, the music turned off, both of us lost in our thoughts. The highway stretched out endlessly in front of us, and every mile felt heavier than the last. Neither of us spoke about what had happened. It was like an unspoken agreement, a shared understanding that some things were better left alone. But the silence didn't make it go away. The questions stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. How did we lose 3 hours? How did we end up safely pulled over on the side of the road? And why couldn't we remember anything? Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I've read stories, listened to podcasts, searched forums for anyone who might have experienced something similar. Some people call it missing time, a phenomenon linked to everything from alien abductions to strange anomalies in the brain. Others dismiss it as a psychological glitch, a moment of collective fatigue or dissociation. But none of those explanations feel right. Because deep down, I know there's more to it than that. I can't explain why, but I do. There's a part of me that's grateful we were unharmed, that we woke up at all. But there's another part, a darker, quieter part, that wonders what happened during those missing hours. What did we see? What did we experience? And why can't we remember? I've never brought it up with my friend again. I think we both prefer it that way. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is still and the memories creep back in, I can't help but wonder if there are pieces of that night buried deep in our minds, locked away like a secret we're not meant to know. And maybe that's for the best, because whatever happened out there on that stretch of highway, it wasn't meant to be understood. Some things are better left in the dark. Redditor 7. Growing up near Edwards Air Force Base, stories about the place were as much a part of life as the desert sun and the sound of jets roaring overhead. Everyone seemed to have a tale. Whispers of strange lights in the sky, experimental aircraft, and things that didn't quite make sense. But the ride-along I did in high school, that's the one that still sticks with me. It was a quiet night, the kind that makes the desert feel endless. I was shadowing the base security cops as part of a career mentorship program. At first, it was all pretty routine: patrols, scanning ID cards at checkpoints, and listening to the officers share stories about their time on the job. But as the night stretched on and the conversation became more casual, the stories took a turn. "You know about boron, right?" one of the cops asked, glancing at me with a half smile. His partner snickered. "Yeah, sure," I replied, trying to sound like I knew more than I did. Everyone in the area knew boron was nearby, but it wasn't exactly a place you went to unless you had a reason. "Lot of weird stuff goes on out there," the cop said, his tone dropping into something more serious, especially near the dry lake beds. "Like what?" I asked, leaning forward in my seat. He glanced at his partner, who shrugged as if giving him the go-ahead. "There's supposed to be a hangar under the dry lake," he said, "one that doesn't officially exist. That's where they test the really advanced stuff, planes, jets, things the public won't see for decades, if ever." I tried to wrap my head around that. I'd heard rumors, of course, but hearing it from someone who worked on the base felt different. "Underground?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "You ever noticed how there are parts of the base that seem off limits even to us? There's a reason for that. Places you don't ask questions about, and people you don't try to find out more about." His partner chimed in. "And if there's a fire alarm at one of those buildings, firefighters don't go in. They're told to stay outside the gates and watch it burn." I blinked, unsure if he was serious. "They just let it burn?" The first cop nodded. "Whatever's in there, it's not worth risking anyone's life or exposing to the outside world." The thought sent a chill down my spine. What could be so secret, so dangerous, that they'd rather let a building burn to the ground than try to save it? "Of course," the first cop added with a smirk, "this could all just be stories to scare the newbies." His partner laughed, but it wasn't a full laugh. It was the kind of laugh that suggested there might be some truth buried beneath the humor. We drove past one of the lake beds later that night, and even though it was pitch black, the place felt eerie. The headlights illuminated the cracked, dry ground, and for a moment I thought I saw something move in the distance, a shadow that darted across the flat expanse. I didn't say anything, chalking it up to my imagination, but my pulse quickened all the same. The rest of the ride along was uneventful, but those stories lingered. Over the years, I've thought about them often, especially when I hear about Edwards in the news or see a military jet streaking across the sky. Were the cops just trying to impress a kid? Maybe, but the way they spoke, the way their voices shifted when they talked about certain parts of the base, it didn't feel like they were joking. And then there are the stories from others in the area. People talk about strange lights over the lake beds, lights that hover and dart away faster than any aircraft should be able to move. Some claim to have heard deep mechanical rumblings late at night, coming from beneath the ground. And then there are the ones who say they've seen things, crafts that defy explanation, figures that aren't quite human. I've never seen anything myself, not really. But sometimes, late at night, when the desert is quiet and the stars are impossibly bright, I think about that ride along, about the things they told me. And I wonder how much of it was just stories and how much of it was the truth. Because out here in the shadow of Edwards Air Force Base, the line between myth and reality is razor thin, and some secrets, I think, are buried for a reason. Redditor 8. Growing up near Edwards Air Force Base felt like living on the edge of a great secret. The place had an aura about it, a mystique born from the countless rumors and stories that seemed to swirl around its dry lake beds and towering hangars. For me, it wasn't just a distant fascination, I lived it. My dad worked at Edwards, deeply involved in experimental flight tests. His job meant that our family was closer to the base's heart than most people ever got. I spent part of my childhood living on the base itself. I still remember the hum of jets overhead, the constant activity that seemed to defy the quiet isolation of the desert around us. When we moved a little farther away, just out of sight of the base but still close enough that its presence loomed large, my connection to it didn't waver. I'd been on base countless times with my dad, seeing glimpses of the cutting-edge work happening there, even if I didn't fully understand it at the time. The dry lake beds at Edwards are their own kind of legend. To most people, they're just massive stretches of cracked, dusty earth. But to those who know the base, they're vital emergency landing fields for test flights that don't go as planned. My dad would talk about how critical those lake beds were, not just for safety, but also as testing grounds for all sorts of projects. He'd shake his head with a grin when people brought up the rumors about hangars hidden beneath the surface. There's no underground base, he'd say, just a lot of failed experiments buried in the sand. The relics of those failed tests fascinated me. The dry lake beds are littered with the remnants of past projects, forgotten prototypes, mangled prototypes, and fragments of aircraft that never quite made it off the drawing board. My dad once showed me the remains of a rocket sled, a massive contraption that had been part of some long-abandoned experiment. It looked like something out of a dystopian future, rusting away under the desert sun. Of course, the night skies over Edwards were another story entirely. The base was home to some of the most advanced aircraft in the world, and many of them were tested under the cover of darkness. My dad explained why testing at night was the best way to keep classified projects hidden from prying eyes. He told me about the F-117 Nighthawk, how it had sparked countless UFO stories before it was officially revealed. People saw its strange angular shape, its silent flight, and leapt to conclusions. In a way, they weren't wrong. It might not have been alien, but it was definitely something otherworldly in its design and capabilities. I'll never forget the first time I saw one of those UFOs for myself. It was late, past my bedtime, and I was sitting on the porch with my dad, staring up at the stars. The desert night was still, the air crisp and clear. Then out of nowhere, a shape moved across the sky. It wasn't like a regular plane or even the jets I'd grown used to seeing around the base. This was different, sleek, angular, and almost invisible against the dark backdrop of the sky. It moved silently, its lights dim and strange, and then it was gone. I turned to my dad, wide-eyed. "Was that?" He chuckled. "That's a test plane, kiddo. Probably the B-2 or something like it. They're working on a lot of things people won't know about for years." That moment stuck with me. It was the first time I realized how much of the world's innovation and its mysteries happened out there in the desert, far from the public eye. My dad's stories only deepened that fascination. He'd talk about experimental planes and jets, some of which were canceled before they were ever announced. He told me about the engineers and pilots who dedicated their lives to pushing the boundaries of what was possible, often with no recognition and plenty of risk. But for every story my dad shared, there were the ones he wouldn't tell. When I pressed him about certain parts of the base, areas we were never allowed to see, projects he never mentioned, He'd just smile and shake his head. Some things, he'd say, aren't meant to be talked about. That was the line he always used when people brought up the wilder rumors, the underground hangars, the secret bases within bases, the supposed UFO sightings. People see what they want to see, he'd say. Most of the time, it's just us doing our job. Still, even he couldn't explain everything, like the fire alarms. There were certain buildings on the base that were so classified, so tightly controlled, that even if they caught fire, the firefighters weren't allowed inside. They'd just stand outside the gates and watch it burn, he said once, almost casually. Can't risk exposing what's in there. That kind of secrecy breeds stories, of course. People see strange lights in the sky or hear unexplained noises in the night, and their imaginations fill in the blanks. My dad didn't blame them. It's human nature, he said. The unknown is always more exciting than the truth. But sometimes, I wonder if the unknown is closer to the truth than he let on. I've read enough accounts, heard enough whispers, to believe there's more to Edwards than even my dad admitted. Maybe it's just the nature of a place like that, a hub for cutting-edge technology, a testing ground for ideas that could change the world. Or maybe it's something else entirely. Even now, as an adult, I find myself looking up at the night sky, wondering what's out there. Not just the stars and planets, but the things we're not meant to see, the things that hover silently over the desert, leaving nothing but questions in their wake. Redditor 9. I was 12 when it happened, old enough to know my own body, but young enough that no one really listened when I spoke about it. It started as a small, hard bump in my earlobe, something I noticed while idly running my fingers over it one day. At first, I thought it was just a zit, something to ignore and let go away on its own. But it didn't go away. For 6 months, it stayed there, a tiny, stubborn presence just under the surface of my skin. When I mentioned it to my parents, they brushed it off. It's just a cyst, my mom said, barely glancing up from the book she was reading. They're common at your age. Don't mess with it and it'll go away on its own. But it didn't. It just sat there, an unwelcome guest lodged in my ear. I'd poke at it, feel its hard, round shape under my skin, and wonder what the hell it was. It didn't hurt exactly, but it was annoying, and more than that, it felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. One night, after weeks of obsessing over it, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed a needle from the little sewing kit in the kitchen drawer, sterilized it with rubbing alcohol, and retreated to the bathroom. My heart was racing, a mix of nerves and determination. At 12, I wasn't thinking about infection or consequences. All I knew was that I wanted it out. I sat in front of the mirror, my earlobe pressed between my fingers. I could feel the bump, hard and unyielding, just beneath the surface. With a deep breath, I poked the needle through the skin. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but I didn't stop. Blood welled up, trickling down my fingers and onto the sink, but I didn't care. I was focused, determined. I squeezed, pushing the bump toward the hole I'd made. It took a few tries, the pressure building with each attempt, and then, with a sudden pop, it came free. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It wasn't pus or fluid like I'd expected. It was a tiny metal ball, about half the size of a BB, black and shiny with a smooth surface. There was an indentation running around its center, almost like a seam, and the surface was covered in microscopic dimples, like a miniature golf ball. I rolled it between my blood-slicked fingers, staring at it in awe. What the hell was this? I turned it over and over, trying to make sense of it. It didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before. Not something organic, not something natural. This was metal, precision-made, something deliberate. Then, as I was inspecting it, the ball slipped from my fingers. It hit the sink with a metallic clink, spun around the porcelain bowl like a marble, and before I could stop it, disappeared down the drain. I froze, my heart sinking. I reached for the drain, my fingers scrabbling at the tiny hole, but it was gone. Just like that, it was gone. I stared at the sink for what felt like hours, my mind racing. What had I just pulled out of my ear? What was that thing and how had it gotten there? I thought about telling my parents, but what could I say? They'd already dismissed the bump as a cyst. They wouldn't believe me, not without proof. When I finally mustered the courage to tell them, it went exactly as I'd expected. My mom barely looked up from her book. "You probably just popped a blackhead," she said. "Don't pick at your skin. Next time, put some tea tree oil on it." But it wasn't. I started, but she cut me off. "Enough," she said firmly. "You're fine." So I dropped it. I didn't bring it up again, didn't mention the blood stains I had to clean out of the sink, or the tiny metal ball that had vanished into the plumbing. But I never forgot it. Even now, years later, I can still feel the weight of it in my fingers, the strange texture of its surface, the way it seemed so impossibly out of place. I've never had anything like it since. No more bumps, no more strange objects. But the memory lingers, a quiet question I can't answer. I've read about things like this. Stories of implants, strange objects found under the skin, unexplained phenomena that defy logic. I don't know if I believe in aliens or abductions, but when I think back to that day in the bathroom, I can't help but wonder, what was it? And why me? Maybe it was just a freak occurrence, some kind of bizarre anomaly that science could explain if I'd only had the foresight to keep the thing. But there's a part of me, a small nagging part, that thinks it wasn't random at all, that it was deliberate, intentional. I'll never know for sure. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and the world feels just a little too strange, I catch myself running my fingers over my earlobe, half expecting to feel that bump again. And I wonder if whatever it was, wherever it came from, is still out there, waiting. Redditor 10. We were 16, full of teenage bravado and itching for adventure, so a camping trip in the mountains of Springville, Utah seemed like the perfect idea. There were 4 of us, a mismatched band of friends with BB guns slung over our shoulders and a cooler full of cheap snacks we'd bought with what little money we had. We pitched our tent in a wide clearing surrounded by trees, the kind of place that made you feel completely cut off from the rest of the world. The night came quickly, swallowing the mountain in a thick darkness that seemed to muffle even the sound of the wind through the trees. Inside the tent, the 4 of us lay sprawled on sleeping bags, talking about nothing and everything, our voices loud and carefree. The canvas walls blocked out the stars, leaving us in a bubble of dim flashlight beams and laughter. It must have been an hour since we'd climbed into the tent when it appeared. At first, it was subtle, a faint glow that barely registered, but then it grew stronger, piercing through the canvas in a way that made the material look paper-thin. The laughter stopped as we all noticed it, our chatter replaced by an uneasy silence. "What the hell is that?" one of us whispered. Without a word, we scrambled out of the tent, the cool night air hitting us like a slap. We looked up and there it was, a light hanging in the sky, glowing in a way that didn't seem right. It wasn't a star or a plane or anything else we'd ever seen before. It was pale and steady, its edges too sharp to be natural, and it cast a faint glow over the mountain valley. "What is that thing?" someone muttered. None of us had an answer. We just stood there, staring at it, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. It didn't move, didn't flicker, just hovered in place, like it was watching us. Minutes turned into 30, and still, the light hung there, casting its eerie glow. The valley below looked otherworldly, bathed in a pale, unnatural light. It was beautiful in a way, but also deeply unsettling. The longer it stayed, the more we felt the weight of its presence, like it wasn't just a light, but something more. Freaked out and unsure of what else to do, we resorted to teenage bravado. We started shouting at it, swearing, trying to break the tension with bravado that none of us actually felt. Someone grabbed a BB gun and aimed it at the light, shaking it in mock defiance. "Go away, you creepy bastard," another yelled, his voice cracking just enough to betray his fear. The light didn't respond. It just stayed there, silent and unbothered, as if it knew how small and powerless we were. And then it moved? Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the light began to descend. It wasn't falling, it was too controlled for that, but it came closer, its glow intensifying as it did. The valley below lit up even brighter, the shadows of the trees stretching long and sharp across the ground. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the fear in the others, even though no one said a word. We backed up instinctively, our bravado gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear. The light stopped again, hovering in its new position, closer to the ground, but still out of reach. It stayed like that for another 30 minutes, just hanging there, as if deciding what to do next. And then it split. The light fractured into 2 separate orbs, each glowing as brightly as the original. For a moment, they hovered side by side, almost like they were communicating. Then, with no warning, one of the orbs ignited with a sudden blue flame and shot off into the sky, disappearing in an instant. The second orb followed suit, its own blue flame erupting as it darted away in a completely different direction. And just like that, the valley was plunged into darkness once more. We stood there, stunned, our BB guns hanging uselessly at our sides. No one spoke. What could we even say? After what felt like an eternity, someone finally broke the silence. Did anyone else see that? We all nodded, too shaken to say much more. We climbed back into the tent, but none of us slept that night. The fear was too fresh. The image of those lights burned into our minds. Every rustle of the trees, every gust of wind felt like a sign that they were coming back. For the next few days, even after we'd returned home, we kept seeing the lights. From our houses in the valley, we'd spot them in the distance, hovering over the mountains like silent sentinels. They never came as close as they had that night, but their presence was unmistakable. We never figured out what they were. Some of us thought it might have been experimental aircraft, something being tested at a nearby base. Others whispered about aliens, though no one wanted to admit they really believed it. Whatever it was, it left a mark on us, a shared memory that we still talk about when we see each other. Even now, years later, I can't look up at the night sky without thinking about those lights. They were beautiful, terrifying, and utterly incomprehensible. And I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting for the next group of kids to stumble across their path. Redditor 11. A few years ago, I was driving through eastern New Mexico, one of those bright, clear days where the sky stretches out forever in a perfect, uninterrupted blue. The kind of day that makes you appreciate the simple act of being on the road, the hum of the tires on the asphalt, and the warmth of the sun cutting through the windshield. Somewhere along the way, I noticed something odd in the sky. At first, it was just a glint, a flicker of light that caught my eye in the otherwise empty expanse. But as I kept driving, it didn't disappear. Instead, it hovered there, a shiny chrome sphere glinting in the sunlight, seemingly pacing my car. It wasn't a plane. There were no wings, no contrails, nothing to suggest it was something conventional. Just a perfect metallic orb hanging in the sky, like it had no business being there. I kept glancing at it, trying to convince myself it was nothing, maybe a reflection off the windshield or a trick of the light, but every time I looked, it was still there, keeping pace with me like it was playing a game. My hands tightened on the wheel, a strange unease settling in my chest. It wasn't moving erratically or doing anything particularly alarming, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way it just existed. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I pulled off the road onto a gravel turnout, the kind that's more weeds than gravel, and parked. The orb was still there, shining against the blue like a polished jewel. I fumbled for my phone, suddenly desperate to capture it before it disappeared. If this was what it looked like, I wasn't just seeing a UFO. I was seeing the UFO, the kind of thing that would send internet forums into a frenzy and have amateur investigators debating for years. I snapped a picture, then another, and then a few more for good measure. I zoomed in, held my breath to steady the shot, and snapped again. Satisfied I'd done all I could, I got back in the car, heart pounding with a strange mix of excitement and dread. Whatever I'd just seen, I had it. Proof. Evidence. Something to show the world that strange things really did happen out here in the wide-open nothingness of the New Mexico desert. The orb stayed in the sky for a little longer, its surface gleaming like a polished mirror. Then, as I pulled back onto the road, it drifted off, vanishing into the horizon as casually as it had appeared. By the time I got home, I was buzzing with anticipation. I transferred the pictures to my computer, ready to pore over every pixel to analyze the shape and detail and maybe, just maybe, find something no one had ever seen before. But as the images loaded on the screen, my excitement began to fade. Zooming in, the orb looked different, less mysterious, more mundane. The reflective surface that had seemed so alien now looked faintly textured, like a balloon stretched too tight. I leaned closer, studying the faint shadows and lines that betrayed its true identity. It was a weather balloon. My heart sank, the thrill of discovery replaced by a dull thud of disappointment. The chrome sphere that had seemed so otherworldly was just a balloon, floating miles away and catching the light in just the right way to play tricks on my mind. I stared at the screen, feeling both foolish and oddly relieved. It wasn't a UFO, it wasn't aliens, it was just a balloon. Looking back, I still laugh at how caught up I got in the moment, how quickly my mind jumped to the most exciting, impossible explanation. And while the truth was more ordinary, I'm still glad I stopped to take those pictures. Glad I let myself believe, even for a little while, that there was something extraordinary out there in the sky. Because maybe next time it won't be a weather balloon. Redditor 11.